McKinley of the Democracy Collaborative, who has come here tonight to speak about potential for community wealth building models in our region. Sarah is manager of community development programs for the Democracy Collaborative. She manages the Learning Action Lab for Community Wealth Building, a multi-year initiative supported by the Northwest Area Foundation, assisting 5 organizations in Indian country to create social enterprises and employee-owned companies. She co-authored Cities Building Community Wealth, the Anchor Dashboard, aligning institutional practice to meet low-income community needs, and raising student voice and student action for university community investment. And she has materials for giveaway and handouts back there related to this. She has a background in community development and has worked with a number of community groups, including the Greater Southwest Development Corporation, a Chicago-based community development corporation, and the National Alliance of Community Economic Development Associations. While earning her master's degree in urban and regional planning at Cornell University, McKinley was a co-author of, quote, A People's Plan for New Orleans, unquote, a bottom-up community development plan for the 9th Ward after Hurricane Katrina. She holds a bachelor degree in urban history from the University of Chicago. In her spare time, McKinley is an avid food lover, is a member of the board of Slow Food DC, the local chapter of an international organization that promotes a good, clean, and fair food system. So without further ado, Sarah McKinley.
Thank you, Brian. I feel like after that introduction, I should just sit down. I feel like you know everything there is to know about us. So thank you very much, Brian. Thank you to Northland College and the League of Women Voters and the Technical College and everybody for putting this together and for inviting me to be here. I'm very honored to be in your community and to be visiting this part of the world, which is a new part of the world for me. So when I got the call, I was like, I want to go. And I was hoping I could turn it into a vacation, but that didn't work out. But I did drive up here this morning from Minneapolis, and so I got a little bit of feel of the countryside and the lay of the land, and I've spent a few hours talking to some of the folks here in your community and have learned that there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on here, a lot of really smart people. So please take everything I have to say as sort of lessons learned from the rest of the country. I obviously don't know your context, certainly as well as you do. So I hope you can take some lessons from this and apply it to your own context, and I hope to get a lot of learnings from you as well, because there's clearly a lot of exciting stuff happening in this room. So looking forward to the discussion. Before I jump into it, I also realized as Brian was talking that we're not really original in our titlings of reports. They're all something, something community and something, something wealth building. So this one is our latest and greatest. This is Cities Building Community Wealth. I did have a few copies back in the back there. Grab one, they're free. If we're out of them, all of our stuff is available, open access, online. You can download it in PDF form on our website, democracycollaborative.org. This particular report is /cities, but we have a number of resources and they're all available open access. So if anything that I say or mention today sparks your interest, please visit our website and see what we have there. So just from talking to people in the room, I'm aware that there's a lot of knowledge already about community wealth building. So I hope I'm not too redundant, but I'm gonna go through what I've prepared here, and if I start to see eyes glazing over, I'll tap dance or something like that. So a little bit about who we are. Brian already gave an introduction. We think of ourselves as a think and do tank. So we sit sort of at the intersection of theory and practice. We focus on the best practices in alternative forms of economic development in communities across the country, lifting up what works and knitting these efforts together in a really conscientious way. And we pair that also with a fair amount of deep thinking and theory around what a more sustainable economic system can be for us, for our communities, and for the future. So we try to learn from theory and also from practice and connect the two and keep iterating. So we work with partners across the country to do so, and we do so through research, field building, and advisory work. And we work with multiple actors at the community level. So in all of this regard, we're working with institutions, we're working with government, we're working with community-based organizations, with resident-led organizations, and all of the key stakeholders at a community level, enterprises, financial institutions, and so forth. So as I talk more, you'll hear me talk about a little bit of the roles that each of those players can play and are playing in communities. So when we talk about community wealth building, what does that mean? So community efforts and strategies to build wealth in communities have been going on for as long as humans have lived in communities together and had economic exchange to fulfill the needs of their community. But community wealth building is a framework that the Democracy Collaborative has coined from studying all these different approaches to building wealth in communities, pulling out the best practices, what works, what doesn't for communities, and knitting that together in a really collaborative, inclusive, and intentional way where economic activity is rooted in place so that it benefits the people and the place within which it is happening. So again, when you start to knit all of these efforts together, and they have been happening and they are happening in communities, if you start to knit them together in an intentional way, you start to see scale coming out of this. You start to see a change to the way that we are currently doing economic development in a lot of our communities. And one of the things that connects a lot of these efforts are looking at different ways of owning resources, assets, and capital. So it's very important to think broadly about that ownership and how that can connect a lot of these activities in place, and then how you can build an ecosystem of support around those activities in those communities to make sure that they're generative and they support one another. So it's a systemic way of thinking about economic development, not a programmatic way, not a single enterprise way of thinking, and not a solely job creation way of thinking about economic development. So why do we need change? Why is this important? We all know that what we're doing in our country right now that passes for economic development isn't working. We see it, we feel it in our communities. The trends, not only in our communities, but nationally and internationally, are staggering. I mean, this statistic, 400 individuals hold almost 2 times the amount of wealth of 185 million people put together. Those are inequality rates higher than the Gilded Age right before the Great Depression. We have never seen this level of inequality in our country ever. This is not a sustainable level of inequality. Societies cannot thrive and live and be successful with this. I mean, this is essentially feudal, right? I mean, you're talking about land-owning gentry, really, in these kinds of statistics. And this is something that's been building, but these statistics are at an all-time high. So before I go on, though, let's talk about wealth. When we say wealth, we don't mean income. And in fact, you know, one of the reasons we're having these kinds of disparities is that there are very few people who actually have wealth beyond income in our society. So when we're talking about wealth, we're talking about assets. Assets like savings, investment, access to resources, ownership of land, property, enterprise, the levers of capital. And those sort of wealth creation tools and wealth creation levers are only accessible to a very few in our country. And that's largely because of the way enterprise and capital is owned in our country. So when we talk about wealth, we're talking about opening that up, broadening that, and making wealth available to people who have traditionally been left out of wealth creation. And those are all kinds of people. It's not just inner city poor. It's people all over the country who don't have access to that kind of wealth opportunity. So we think that economic development and the policies and methods of doing economic development in our community has had a role to play in creating these kinds of statistics. The way that economic development has been done hasn't been working, and it's resulting in these levels of inequality. And so that we believe that there needs to be a new way of thinking about economic development, and we present community wealth building as that new way of thinking. So I'm going to go through 7 drivers of community wealth building, and we identified these drivers as being really the key connected drivers and elements of a healthy community wealth building initiative. The beauty of community wealth building is this is meant to reflect the needs of the communities. There are additional drivers that you can add here. We're working with partners that have added their own additional drivers to community wealth building, but we've pulled out the ones that we think are the most salient, that really differentiate a community wealth building approach from a traditional economic approach. So, first and foremost, a community wealth building approach starts in place. It is meant to be a place-based approach to thinking about economy and growing the economy. It's rooted in place, and it's meant to benefit people in place. Also, I see that people are coming in. There are plenty of chairs up front if you don't want to sit on the floor. You can sit on the floor if you want, but there are also plenty of chairs. So it starts with place. Traditional economic development, the way we're doing it in communities right now, generally doesn't focus on place. It's focused on attracting enterprises, attracting businesses from outside of the community that aren't necessarily committed to the place, committed to the people who live there, committed to the resources and the environment of that location. So community wealth building, as opposed to a traditional approach, is oriented towards place. How do you root things in place? Again, you root things in place by broadening and opening ownership to more people, to people living in place. And I'll talk a little bit more about different ways that you can do that and the way that communities can do that. Traditional economic development, the way it stands right now, is that most corporations, most companies, most job developers, job creators are owned by investors. They're owned by people who generally don't live in the community and are oriented towards profit. And so their motive is not connected to the outcomes within the community. And then once you can root things in place, you start to see dollars and money circulating and staying in place rather than going outside of the community. When you're spending money at a large corporation that isn't owned or rooted in that community, the profits, the dollars, the output from that enterprise is going back to whomever, the Koch brothers, you name it, some other firm, some investment firm on Wall Street. They're not staying in the community, they're not circulating, they're not creating other economic impacts. So community wealth building focuses on those multiplier effects, recirculating those dollars. And how can it do that? It does that by working with multiple actors in the community, key players who are there that are vested in the community. We're all in it together. You can't do this on your own. It's not just one corporation. It's not just the government working, the levers of policy to support or incent or subsidize those businesses. It's all the institutions, all the stakeholders in place. And it has to be done with a mindset of including especially those communities and those people who have been left out of economic activity, intentionally including those. The trickle-down approach that, if you build it, all will benefit, has only worked so much for so many people. So community wealth building is an approach that is very intentional in including those communities and those community actors who have been excluded in the past. And one of the main ways of doing that is created connected pipelines for workforce development that responds to actual existing demand already in the community and pairs it with existing need and building that capacity and matching those, rather than what seems to happen often in our communities, training people for jobs that don't exist, building sort of generic job training programs that don't end in a job, don't end in support for those employees, and so forth. And all of this comes together, as I said earlier, to create an ecosystem of institutions and support that can support a generative economy in place. So that's the goal. The goal is to connect these into systems. As I said, some of our partners add additional layers. One of our partners works in a very multicultural area in the Twin Cities and really thinks that culture has to be a driver of economic activity. So thinking through the cultural context of the economic activity that's being generated. So this is a framework that's meant for people to think through the activities that are happening in the community and connect them within this framework, and then add to it what works for that community and that place. So let's dig in a little bit to some of these drivers. Starting, of course, with place. And as I said before, place matters. Place affects your health. It affects your access to resources. The environment, again, affects your health and what you can do, what opportunities you have, your sense of connectivity to the world around you, your sense of hope and opportunity. Place is very important in shaping who we are and what we do. And this is just a visual representation of this. This is Cleveland. On your left, this is the community of Huff. It's an African-American low-income community with high rates of unemployment. The life expectancy for adult male is 64 years of age. Just 8 miles away in a very close-in suburb, well-off, affluent, high employment rates, generally Caucasian suburb, 88 years life expectancy. That's a 22-year difference in life expectancy in an 8-mile difference. And what's interesting here is this low-income neighborhood is right next to two of the biggest economic generators in Cleveland, University Hospital, Cleveland Clinic, Case Western University, right next door. And yet, people don't live past their mid-60s. We work with partners on the Pine Ridge Reservation. The life expectancy for adult Lakota male is 46 years of age. That is the lowest life expectancy rate in the Western Hemisphere, short of Haiti. And that's here in the United States. It's unacceptable. And so place matters, and we have to think of things. Problems are place-based. We need place-based solutions to our place-based problems. So how do we root things in place? Again, as I said, access and ownership to the levers of capital and wealth production are key to that. And one way of doing this is thinking through different ways of opening up that capital ownership. And you can do that through different kinds of inclusive ownership. And so a lot of these you're familiar with. Cooperatives, employee stock ownership plans, municipal ownership, nonprofit social enterprise. So again, rather than being owned by absentee investors, these are different ways of owning capital in your community, owning enterprise in your community. And some are more inclusive than others, some are more democratic than others. There's a whole spectrum, but there are a lot of opportunities. So digging into these, and there was another report on the back that really outlined some of these different ownership forms. I only had 5, so there weren't enough. But again, it is available for free on our website if you want to check us out. Now, a lot of you in the audience probably are familiar with all of these models. Wisconsin and this area has a really strong tradition of cooperative ownership and of broadly held ownership. People are very aware of cooperatives. Producers and consumer cooperatives are the most common, and I know there are many up here, especially in agriculture, so a lot of producer cooperatives in agriculture, but there are also employee-owned cooperatives where employees benefit directly and share in the profit of those cooperatives. Employee stock ownership plans, it's another form of employee ownership, but rather than sort of a one person, one vote method like the cooperatives, this is investment in a stock plan, so you get a percentage of the company. CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions, a broad term for community-owned banking and financial institutions, grew out of largely African-American communities that were actually literally blocked from banking with traditional banks, so they created mutual aid societies, and you started to see mutual aid societies become institutionalized in the form of community development financial institutions. Also credit unions and others are part of that. And generally, CDFIs have a community-led board, and they're committed to generating that capital within the community. Social enterprise, it's a term you are hearing all over the place right now. Any corporation that has a positive mission is going to start calling themselves a social enterprise. And that's a good trend, right? We want corporations to be thinking about triple bottom line, people, planet, profit, that sort of thing. This is a good thing, but when we at the Democracy Collaborative talk about social enterprise, we're generally talking about a structure of enterprise that is owned by a nonprofit holding company so that the enterprise is fulfilling the mission of that nonprofit and also generating revenue to support the work of that nonprofit. So it's owned broadly by a nonprofit, ideally a community-based nonprofit that has accountability to community actors. Municipal enterprise, of course you see this most often in utilities. The idea being there that this is an accountable way of owning resources rather than it being owned by a small group of wealthy people who control and have no accountability to community or place. Municipal enterprise, at least in theory, is supposed to be more reactive and accountable to place. And then you're starting to see a lot more sort of hybrids, different forms of enterprise, different forms of ownership, benefit corporations, LC3s, which are limited liability corporations that can profit but aren't as wedded in the tax code to profit, so on and so forth. I am not an MBA, so I really can't dig into the details of that. But if you're interested, we can get you research on that. What's not on here are things like community land trust, which is a way of holding land collectively to maintain affordability. So a few examples. Again, I know many people in the room are familiar with this, but they're all these kinds of enterprises, these kinds of ownership are all over the place. They're all around us. People probably know New Belgium Brewery. They do the Fat Tire beer that you can now find all over. Probably not as good as some of the local brews here, so I hope to find that out later after 9. But it's the third largest craft brewery in the country, $180 million in revenue, and it is 100% employee-owned through an employee stock ownership plan. Really, really low rates of turnover, high retention, 3%. A really interesting example is not too very far from here in La Crosse, Wisconsin, which I know is probably like 5 hours from here, but nonetheless, is what's known as the Fifth Season Cooperative. It's a multi-stakeholder cooperative. It's a really interesting model. In fact, I haven't seen it anywhere else in the country. It has 6 member classes of the cooperative, so it's pretty complex. I'm not going to remember all 6, but there's at least a buyer class, a purchaser class, a worker class, a grower class, a processing class, and I don't remember the 6. But it has this different member structure so that the members can engage at different levels and share in different aspects of the production and profit. What it does is it aggregates food from small farms, small local farms, and then has a value-added layer on top of it where they process the food so that it can be frozen or canned or so on and so forth so that they can get the most out of the short growing period and meet the needs of large anchor institutions in their community, mainly Gunderson Lutheran, which is a large hospital network in that area. I'm sure you guys know more about it than I do, but Gunderson had a mission to go net zero by 2020 or something like that. And so figuring out how they can supply all their food needs by local farmers was a huge part of that. And so they worked with Fifth Season Cooperative to get to that scale. And this is how they did it. Social enterprise, Pioneer Human Services in the Seattle area in Washington is a really phenomenal example. It started in the 60s as a traditional social service organization employing returning citizens, servicing returning citizens, and they found that the biggest problem, the biggest barrier that returning citizens from the judicial system faced was getting a job. They could not get jobs. jobs. With a record, they couldn't get a job. So instead of providing services to people that they then sent out and had no recourse for economic activity, they decided they were going to start their own enterprises where they could employ those people and serve a community need. 40 years later, they have multiple enterprises that do anything from food services, manufacturing, recycling, all sorts of things that serve the needs of the community, and they employ over 700 people, all of them, or the vast majority of them, ex-offenders. And they create enough profit through these enterprises that they are able to almost fully self-sustain the services the support services that they continue to provide to their population. So that's a big shift in, as I sometimes refer to it, as the nonprofit industrial complex, where we're so reliant on grant funding and we're unable to sustain ourselves. So a really interesting model there. These are not just small altruistic efforts. These efforts have positive economic outcomes for communities. And cooperatives have shown over and over again to greatly improve wages for cooperative members, especially those in low-income fields. So this is just one study of wages, now known as Prospera, based in the Bay Area, where after becoming co-op members, these are generally Latina immigrant house cleaners. After they joined the co-op, their wages almost more than doubled. That's just one study, but this is shown over and over again in studies of worker-owned cooperatives. Municipally owned utilities almost always have lower rates, saving costs for customers and residents. Community land trusts, significantly lower foreclosure rates during the housing bubble, almost nil compared to the rest of traditional home ownership. So really sustainable and building that base of sort of asset ownership in the form of a home without risk of being affected by market shocks. And ESOPs, and employee stock ownership plans, members generally have higher savings, higher rates of retirement, and higher retention rates. And they are also significant actors in our national economy. This is a big portion of our GDP, our gross domestic product. Cooperatives, and this is all forms of cooperatives, not just worker cooperatives, make up $3 trillion of our GDP. That's pretty significant. This isn't small cake, small pie. I don't know what the phrase is here. Nonprofits, hospitals, and universities, at least $2 trillion. This number is probably low, but why are hospitals and universities an important part of this puzzle? So, hospitals and universities are what we call anchor institutions. They're one of a number of anchor institutions. And I know everybody in this room has heard that term, are familiar with, have worked with anchor institutions. Northland College is acting as an anchor institution, but what does that really mean? What does it mean to be an anchor institution? So they're place-based, they're not going anywhere, they're generally nonprofit or publicly owned, and they have a mission to serve, whatever that might be broadly, to educate, to heal, to provide culture. But they have a mission, and generally it's a mission to people and to place. So what does that mean? They're generally not going to go anywhere. I went to the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago thought in the 1960s that maybe it would move from the south side of Chicago. It did a whole lot of studies on how it could move from the south side of Chicago. It realized that it probably couldn't move from the south side of Chicago, so instead it just bulldozed all the neighborhoods around it. So that's not good anchor institution behavior, but it has been for a very long time in a traditional approach to dealing with the conflict between institutions and the community around them. So we're trying to get away from that. So when we talk about anchor institutions, we're talking about institutions that recognize that their success is intimately linked to the success of the communities within which they reside. So when we at the Democracy Collaborative talk about an anchor institution mission, and I'm just going to read this because we've thought a lot about the precise words that went into this, we talk about the anchor institution mission to conscientiously apply the place-based economic power of the institution with its human and intellectual resources to better the long-term welfare of the community within which it resides. So it's a conscientious acknowledgement of the impact an institution has in place and connecting that to the long-term benefits of that place. So these are economic actors. Some of, as we now know, especially in our post-industrial world, hospitals and universities especially, but also governments, cultural institutions are our largest employers in many of our communities. They are some of the biggest purchasers of goods and services. They have mission to educate and things of that nature, but they are also large economic actors. So and they invest, they have endowments, they develop real estate, they are having an economic impact daily on the communities within which they reside. So how can anchor institutions and the communities work together to leverage that impact, that economic activity, to the benefit of those communities and link that together to revitalize neighborhoods, create affordable housing, generate positive economic activity in their communities. So, how does this stuff all come together? The enterprises, the anchor institutions, the community-based organizations, we think of these as the balancing third force in economic development. So this is a simplistic yet illustrative infographic of what we're thinking about here. And on the left-hand side, you see this unbalanced triangle that's about to topple over with the corporation dominating the levers of economic activity, with sort of government down here trying to keep up and doing what they can at the whim of the corporation. This is sort of the bad model, if you will, of economic development. And then on the right, when you insert these community actors, it's a balancing force. You have the stable triangle as it should be, not going to tip over with these actors, the institutions, the community organizations, and so forth, balancing out the influence of the corporations and the government. It's important to note that the corporations and the government still have a really important role to play. They're part of this bigger picture, but they need to be balanced by the commitment of the third force, the community actors. So what does this look like when it starts to play out in place in communities? And this is sort of a diagram of what we call, and what Brian mentioned, the Cleveland model. This is the way that we really tried to work on this in Cleveland. So I'll talk a little bit about the Evergreen Cooperatives in my next slide, but the Evergreen Cooperative model is one that can be used for communities all over in different ways that best fit the community. So as you see here, you've got the institutions in the middle. They're linked to government, they're linked to community foundations, they're linked to community-based organizations, training programs, and things of that nature, funneling into and supporting worker-owned companies and enterprises that then provide goods and services back to these actors as well. And the benefits of those enterprises are creating this positive feedback loop in communities of jobs and ownership and wealth and development. So that's the goal. This is sort of a visual representation of that goal. And in Cleveland, we tried this starting in 2009, working with the Cleveland Foundation, which is one of the largest community foundations in the country. It's the oldest community foundation in the country. It's very well endowed, and it's a very key player in the economic ecosystem of Cleveland. And the Cleveland Foundation, Cleveland used to have some of the highest congregation of Fortune 500 companies in the country outside of New York. People don't realize this. It was a very prosperous city. It was a boom town. And that obviously changed in the post-war period, in the deindustrialization period. And Cleveland actually is half the size in population than it used to be at its peak in the 1950s. But there are these world-class institutions that were built up when Cleveland was in its boom period. The Cleveland Clinic, the University Hospitals, Case Western Reserve University, Cleveland State University. These are nationally recognized institutions. And they're in a part of the city called University Circle, which is literally a geographical area where all these institutions are clustered, and they're completely surrounded by blight. blighted communities, low-income communities, communities of color with high unemployment. Totally disconnected from this center of economic activity. So the Cleveland Foundation realized, you know, those Fortune 500 companies aren't coming back. Our industry is not going to come back like it did in you know, the war years. This isn't going to happen. But we do have these assets. We have this economic activity going on. How do we better connect it to the communities that have been hit the hardest by our post-industrial landscape? How can we connect their needs to those communities? And the Cleveland Clinic had the gravitas and the convening power to start to bring those institutions to the table, as well as the community actors and the community-based organizations, the resident associations and so on, and start to think about how can the institutions recognize their local economic impact and direct that there. And that's when we came in. So the Democracy Collaborative was asked by the Cleveland Foundation to come and work with this conglomerate, now called the Greater University Circle Initiative, to think through this. And we did a number of analysis, and the net result was the Evergreen Cooperative Corporation, which is currently 3 networked cooperatives, so they're networked to one another. They have a holding company over them, and they provide goods and services to the institutions. They're all employee-owned, so employees can vest into the company after a year of successful employment, and then share in the profits of those companies, as well as access other benefits, like there's a homeownership assistance program and things of that nature, that hiring all locally from 6 identified neighborhoods around the University Circle. So currently, there's a large industrial green laundry that provides laundry services to the hospitals. There's a green retrofit company. It's essentially a construction company. It does solar installation, but it also does construction retrofitting, LED replacement, things of that nature. And then Green City Growers, which is a huge hydroponic greenhouse in the center of an urban neighborhood in Cleveland. The Evergreen Cooperatives are structured in such a way that the goal is for there to be more cooperatives. As they become successful, as these cooperatives profit more, not only do the employees share in the profit, but there's a revolving loan fund that they then return money back into, and as that revolving loan fund grows, they can then spin off additional enterprises. So right now, there are about 150 employees, and about half of them are owners. Again, there's a vesting period for them to come into that. And, you know, can't really have owners sharing in profits until you're profitable. so the first enterprise was founded in 2009. It wasn't profitable until 2013. So, you know, it takes a while. Green City Growers is the newest one. It opened its doors in 2012. It is about to become profitable. So they're about to have their first profit share with the vested owners. And if people want to talk more about the capital stack around that and how these were created and how they were funded and what that looks like, I can go into that. I'll say quickly, you know, this was not an easy effort, but it's really starting now, 7 years later, to have really positive results for the communities and for the people working there. So, but that is 7 years later. You know, when they talk about enterprise, they say what, one in 3 enterprises fail after the 3rd year. We believe, especially for enterprises working in low-income communities or disadvantaged communities, that where traditionally those rates are even higher, that failure rate is even higher, that if we actually create supportive ecosystems around these enterprises, that doesn't have to be the case. They don't have to fail so frequently. This doesn't have to be sink or swim. So that's kind of the hypothesis behind this, and it's an interesting product or process. So how can one do this? How can a community do this kind of work? We've sort of come up with 6 broad strategies for how to implement this, and I'll go through them pretty quickly and then show examples. So again, anchor institutions. There are many ways that anchor institutions can play a role in the community. Procurement is probably the easiest lever because all of them buy things. And all of them can think through how they can buy those things locally. So tapping in to anchor procurement and relocalizing, as we say, anchor procurement. Financing, partner with local financing institutions, CDFIs, credit unions, things of that nature to directly invest money. Institutions can do that, governments can do that, individuals can do that. But then also you can create things like revolving loan funds, which I just talked about, where local enterprises can access capital and then return their loans to grow that fund for future enterprises, future endeavors around the way. So one way that we're seeing sort of an interesting way of tapping into anchor institution procurement is in Chicago. Chicago Anchors for a Strong Economy, or CASE, is a new effort. It's just about 2 years old, started by World Business Chicago, which is essentially their chamber of commerce. It's a network of 15 large anchor institutions across the city of Chicago who have all committed to analyzing their spend and relocalizing some of it. So it's working with all of those institutions together in a collaborative manner to think through that process and then match it to local capacity. So it's sort of a matchmaking service, but it also provides capacity building and technical assistance to local enterprises and to local service providers to think through how they can meet those demands. So those who don't know a lot about how things work behind the scenes at anchor institutions, the way anchor institutions procure right now, sort of the prevailing model, which is not really, this is a new way of doing things, new as in the past 30 years. Anchor institutions used to have to get goods and services from their community because there wasn't any other choice. But nowadays what they do is they purchase through what's called GPOs, group purchasing organizations, and they're generally large corporations like Sodexo, Aramark, you know the names, and they have contracts with these corporations, generally 10 years or more, so it's very difficult to get out of those contracts. And those group purchasing organizations do things like aggregate the laundry for your hospital system and ship it to Mexico so that they can wash your sheets super, 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 super cheap because the labor is super, 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 super cheap, and then ship it back to you in Cleveland or in Wisconsin or whatever. So that's the prevailing model right now. So that doesn't make sense on many levels, but it doesn't make sense for institutions. And institutions are starting to recognize that, especially as we start to have more climate disruptions, that this is not a reliable way. And when you start to think through the actual cost of goods, not just like the price per sheet, or pound of laundry, 40 cents per pound of laundry, but you start to factor in the cost of shipping, you're not actually saving that much more money to do it that way. So really thinking through the full economic impact of what it means to do business this way is a powerful tool in shifting the way business is done. So enterprise development, how can communities incent different ways of enterprise development? So making money available, direct investment in cooperative development. You're seeing more and more city governments actually put money directly into cooperative development. Also a lot of incubator and accelerator programs for local enterprise. You're seeing more and more of that. And then sustainable land use, thinking about land use as a sort of collective good, if you will, as a commons, and how do you do that? What are the tools for doing that? Community land trusts are one, land banks, public land, community gardens, parks, things of that nature. Again, these aren't new ideas, but thinking through how you can connect those sorts of resources. Again, I said a lot of cities are investing directly in cooperative development. This is just one example of a pretty high-profile example because it's New York City. New York City invested, I think, is it $3 million over 2 years directly into cooperative development in the city. New York City is home of Community Cooperative Home Care Associates. That's the largest cooperative in the country. It's an employee-owned cooperative. There are 2,300 members, and when I say largest cooperative, I mean largest employee-owned cooperative. Of course, they're bigger producer cooperatives, many of them actually here, and I'm sure you know of, not here, right here, but in Wisconsin. They produced high-paying jobs, well, good-paying jobs for a traditionally low-income field. Home care workers are very poorly paid, they have little protections, they have little benefits, and cooperative home care actually provides a living wage, and they provide benefits for their workers as well. It's been a very successful model, largely employing immigrant women in the Bronx and other places like that. So New York wanted to explore how they could incentivize other models like that to pop up. But New York is just one example. Madison, Wisconsin, right here in the state, but far away still, has invested $5 million over 5 years into cooperative development, a real commitment for a city of that size. And they're also investigating a $5 million revolving loan fund for enterprise development broadly, not just cooperative development, but social enterprise development. So you're starting to see strategies like that. And again, that's on the city government side, leveraging some of their federal dollars for enterprise development. And then finally, sort of the last two strategies, and I'm sure these are very important, or at least the ecological resilience. There's a lot of opportunity in the new green economy, if you want to call it that, whatever the phrase is, the sustainable economy. New ways of creating energy, more sustainable ways of handling our environment. In the next 30 to 40 years, there's commitment from the federal government to invest $2 to $3 billion in coastal protection, $2 billion in bridges and infrastructure development, $5 to $10 billion in wastewater management and treatment. These are huge opportunities for enterprise development, for tapping into that funneling of resources into communities. And then connecting that to actual workforce development. So an example of not necessarily green economy, but connecting and creating pipelines for workforce development. This is a Cleveland model as well. Step up to university hospitals. The hospital realized they were having high rates of turnover in entry-level positions, so they did a study to find out why. It was costing them money, and they found out that the vast majority of their entry-level employees were coming from afar. They were coming from the suburbs commuting in. They had trouble with transportation, and they didn't have supports there, so they left. And here, right next door, they have all these communities where jobs are needed. So they worked directly with local community-based training providers to actually specialize and make specific their training programs to the needs of those entry-level employment positions, and then create actually ladders up within the hospital system, so they're not just sort of dead-ending at those positions. And all the while, they're working with the community organizations to continue to provide support to those employees in those positions. They now have a 90% retention rate through this new program, a huge improvement for the hospital and obviously for the people getting jobs. So what does this look like when everything starts to come together in a community? Denver, Colorado is a city that has conscientiously taken on community wealth building as their approach to community economic development. So they have a community wealth building initiative that connects the city, the community foundation, the Land Conservancy Group, and a number of community-based organizations. The city's invested directly in local community groups for the creation of a similar multi-stakeholder urban food cooperative that'll be a food hub. They've done things like done a power purchasing agreement, which I was talking to someone in the audience here. It sounds like that's something that's happening here as well, around group purchasing of photovoltaics to reduce costs to consumers. And they're also doing really intentional transit-oriented development, where Denver has some of the fastest growing costs of living in the country. It's increasingly a more and more expensive city to live. They're doing a whole rapid transit development, and they realize, obviously, that housing rates and costs of living are going to go up along that development. So thinking through how they can do that development with an eye towards equity and affordability, they're doing community land trusts at specific nodes to maintain that affordability. And lest you think that everything we do is focused on urban areas, a lot of this work is very applicable to a rural area. As I mentioned earlier, we're working with 2 organizations on the Pine Ridge Reservation. which is the Oglala Lakota Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. And one of the groups is Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation. Is a youth-led organization that grew out of sort of a cultural and spiritual resurgence led by youth on the reservation, where they sort of asked themselves, you know, things are bad here. I mentioned the life expectancy rate, but what can we do about it? What can we ourselves do to address that? And so they began a whole community-wide planning process, and they engaged all different groups across the res. And over again, they found that they needed housing and they needed jobs. They needed housing and they needed jobs. And no one's going to come and create housing and jobs. Federal government has thrown money at reservations and nothing has come of it. So they said to themselves, we need to create our own solutions here at Thunder Valley. So they formed this community development corporation. They managed to buy up 33 acres of contiguous fee simple land, which is not an easy thing to do, but they did so with grants from the federal government. And were able to buy up and now own 33 contiguous acres, and they're building a whole regenerative community from the ground up that will involve housing, cultural spaces, spiritual spaces, enterprise spaces, farm space, wastewater rejuvenation. They're doing this all based on indigenous methods, indigenous housing forms, and it's going to be net zero waste production. And so as they started to do this plan, they realized they're going to generate a whole lot of economic activity as they build this out. The expedient way, because you know a lot of that skill, a lot of that capacity doesn't exist on the res. The expedient way would be to hire a contracting firm, an architecture firm from Rapid City or Denver, Colorado. But that would not create the skill, the capacity, the benefits to the community. So what they've done instead is they've taken the time to develop a whole workforce training program for Lakota youth to learn these indigenous building methods, to become experts in this net zero construction. And they've created, just this month, they've created an employee-owned construction company so that those people who are gaining those skills can come out of the workforce training program and get a job in a construction company where they're also owners. So they're building their own community, they're learning skills, and they're getting benefits from that. And then the idea is that this will be a needed skill and a needed skill set across the region and perhaps across the country. But that's just one of multiple enterprises that they see coming out of this regenerative community that they're building. They're going to need property management, they're going to need wastewater management, they're going to need landscaping. So it's just the first step in a whole network of linked enterprises that will be employee-owned, that will be rooted in Lakota values. So how do you even get started doing all of this? First of all, you're probably doing it already. By just having this conversation, and I know this is the second in many conversations that you're having, and bringing different stakeholders, different committed parties to the table, you're already doing this work. Building those relationships is really the first step. Building relationships, collaborating, and identifying roles. What is it that you can do? What are you doing already? And how can you connect this to a bigger vision? One thing we talk about, and I think I mentioned this already, is mutual self-interest. We're all in this together, and there are ways to find out what it is that makes an institution or a community group or an individual vested in this, and how do you align those? And you know, not everyone's going to agree, but you're probably going to have a common goal of improving your community. So really building those relationships and figuring that out. And then understanding what the assets are that you have in your community. We've been so oriented towards a deficit-based model where all we see is the low income or the poverty or the lack of jobs or the environmental degradation, and we don't actually see the real assets that are in our communities. And there's so many, and it's so rich, and you know, even from just being here for 3 hours, I'm learning about all the institutions and all the actors and all the different groups, and you know, understanding what those assets are linking them together, and then figuring out what the gaps are. What don't you have locally? What could you have locally? Figure that out. And that's where you get to the demand question. Where is the demand for those things? Is there demand for those things? And how can you connect both what already exists and what you can fill the gaps in to that demand? Again, fostering a collaborative approach to that. Don't reinvent the wheel. You as an institution or you as an organization do not have to do this all yourself. It's a bad use of your resources, especially if there's someone who can do it better. So do it in a collaborative approach, and then always be planning for the next phase and evaluating. If it's not working, why isn't it working? What can we do better? Be ready to change, keep changing, keep innovating. We get so stuck in this is the way things are done that we don't think of how we can do it differently. And we probably are doing it differently, but we don't even identify that. So keep thinking about what a different way of doing it is. So, what are some of the easy wins? Once you've started really building that ecosystem, laying that groundwork, what are some of the things that you can do to get this work going? How can you shift away from business as usual? Again, don't reinvent the wheel. Think of what's already going on. Shift incentives. You know, you're probably not going to get cities and states and county governments to stop dishing out incentives to corporations. That would be great, but it's not going to happen. So how can you shift that to actually benefit local enterprise or local enterprise development? How can you shift what's already being done? And then how can you add to that maybe a layer of accountability? Okay, great, so we're going to give incentive to an enterprise, and you say you're going to create 300 jobs, but you really only create 50. Well, then give us back our money so that we can actually build the bridges and the infrastructure that you demand for your business. So you can layer in accountability measures, clawback measures as they call it. Again, how can you look at enterprise you already have and convert it to different forms of ownership so that you don't risk losing it by investors or sale or closure. And then you can do things like create a city office, for example, or an initiative where you have multiple actors coming to the table. You can connect the workforce development programs that you already have into the direct needs of institutions and things of that nature. So again, work with what you've got and start on sort of these easy wins. None of this is easy, let's be real, but it's a start. And then there are a lot of opportunities that are happening sort of broadly, broader trends that can really accelerate this work and help it get to scale. So I mentioned already the stormwater management crisis, how much money is being funneled into that by the federal government, the EPA. How can you tap into that to incentivize local enterprise development and to get job training around those new forms of business that are coming out of that. The ACA, the Affordable Care Act, is actually mandating that hospitals think of health as not just clinical health, but as sort of whole health, full health, and understand the social determinants of health. So there's a deep incentive for hospitals to now be thinking beyond just clinical and medical health to preventative care and what that means in your environment. And over and over again, the studies are showing that social determinants of health, poverty, access, opportunity, all of these things are huge determinants of health. So getting hospitals to think about those social determinants of health more broadly as a preventative measure to keep people from coming in repeatedly to the hospitals, to the centers. Baby boom enterprise retirement. 4 million businesses across the country are owned by what you would sort of label as baby boomers, who are at the point of retiring, and oftentimes, you know, family-owned businesses owned by these people are not going to be taken over by their children. There's a very low success rate of sort of family-owned businesses staying in families. What often happens, the vast majority, is that they get bought up by investors who are looking to make a profit, and then if they don't hit efficiency metrics, they close them, or they move them, or they downsize them. I was talking with Eric Schubring on your local Indigenous radio station the other day, and he was telling me about an example of the paper mills and how that happened over and over and over again with paper mills in this region. So instead of having sort of baby boomer owned companies be sold and then closed, how can you convert them to employee ownerships, turn the ownership of that enterprise over to the employees? They'll be incentivized to keep their own jobs and to keep them rooted in the community. They're most likely not going to want to outsource their jobs somewhere else. So that's one thing that we're really looking at. It's a great opportunity to really encourage this kind of broadly held ownership. So lots of opportunities in the environment right now. I am talking too much and I'm done. So I hope you have a lively discussion. You can email me if you want any resources. And again, go to our website, democracycollaborative.org. You can get all of our reports open access, but then also communitywealthbuilding.org is not just about us. There are a whole lot of other resources on there from the field. Resources on community land trust, on ESOPs, on cooperative, on things like that you can get open access on that website. So thank you very much. And I look forward to